You may be seated. I apologize. I feel fine, but I am battling a cold, and I am precipitously losing my voice as I speak, which I'm sure makes my wife and children very happy, but might not make the wedding couple tonight where I'm officiating as happy, so I'll try and protect that part of the voice. And today I wanted to do something a little less conventional for this slot, this time, where I usually deliver a sermon, or Rabbi Feinberg or Rabbi Ruberg delivers a sermon. And I wanted to do something that is quasi-interactive and a little bit more educational. And the reason is because there have been some significant issues that happened in the state of Israel this week. And I thought it'd be important for us to take a deeper dive and start to understand why those things happen in the state of Israel, what we can be better prepared for when we're having conversations around our water cooler, and perhaps asking some important questions of things that need to be addressed. And I'll try and leave time for that now. And if not, please, at the Kiddush, do not hesitate to ask me any questions you might have. But in order to understand what happened in Israel this week, you first have to turn back your clocks. Almost exactly 40 years ago this week. It was actually 40 years ago last week. Does anyone know what happened 40 years ago last week in United States history? Wow, young crowd. Someone say it? I can't hear. Very good. Jonathan Sherrill. Right? What's that? Bruce said it too? Okay, all good. 40 years ago, something happened. And that was the Shah. It was really a little bit before 40 years ago. The Shah of Iran, who was the ruler and dictator of Iran and had led the country of Iran for many, many years, was overthrown. And one of the reasons he was overthrown is because there were significant issues of corruption in Iran. The Shah had enriched himself off the Iranian people. Those who protested against the Shah were punished and sometimes killed. Even Barbara Walters asked him in an interview once, is it legal for people to disagree with you or to challenge you? And he said, yes, it is illegal for them to do so, and they deserve to be punished in doing so. So he was really quite of a dictator, although he had fantastic relationship with America because they traded oil. And he had a great relationship with the state of Israel. There were El Al, God bless you, there were El Al flights twice a week from Tehran to Tel Aviv until last week, 40 years ago. Okay, think about that. There was an El Al office in Tehran. But shortly after the Shah was overthrown, they instituted another prime minister, and that created the oil energy crisis that we had here in America in the 70s. And a group of young people, college age, were the ones who protested the loudest and who demanded that they have a different sense of role in their community. And in doing so, they really turned to their religion, and many of them became radicalized, and even the prime minister who was replacing the Shah was quickly overthrown and became the leader, a man by the name of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was a radical Muslim cleric. He wanted to bring Sharia law, or a sense of Islamic law, back to Iran. And in doing so, he took these young, impressionable people and radicalized them as a whole. And in a scheduled protest, which ironically was supposed to happen at the Russian embassy, but in a late audible, sometime between 2 and 3 days before, decided to protest outside the American embassy. They knew that these protesters would jump the gates, but they did not know that they would jump the gates and storm the building. A sense of groupthink took over. And the Marines that were on guard asked for permission from the State Department and a quick communication, should we open fire? And the State Department said, absolutely not. We don't want to create World War III by opening fire on these protesters. Just allow them to protest. But little did we know at that time that their frustration would result in breaking into the embassy and holding those hostages for a total of 400 and something days until, did anyone know the date they were released? January 20th, 1981, and intentionally waited until the transfer of power happened to Ronald Reagan. They kept the hostages on the tarmac, and that was for just an interesting reason, because Carter, who had negotiated this release for the release of funds, was planning to travel to Wiesbaden, Germany, to greet the hostages. And the Iranians did not want to present that optic for Carter. So they held them on the tarmac because he couldn't be in two places at one time, and he had to be at the inauguration for the transfer of power. So it's important to know that history. And as a result of that history 40 years ago, Iran has become a radicalized regime, at least in its leadership, and Iran has become the largest state sponsor of terror in the world and perhaps in modern history, probably since the Third Reich. To give you an idea of what Iran has been involved in, they were responsible for a 10-year war that Saddam Hussein capitalized on when he saw this transfer of power in Iraq, which became the Sunni-Shia war of 10 years between Iran and Iraq, and terrible things that happened. But also there was an embassy bombing in 1983 in Beirut, happened because of Iran and their hand, and the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut shortly after, because of Iran, the 1985 hijacking of TWA Flight 847, the 1992 bombing of the Israeli embassy in Argentina, the 1994 bombing of the AMIA building, which is like the JCC and the Federation building that happened in Buenos Aires, the 2012 Burgas bombing in Israel of Israelis in Bulgaria, just to name a few. Now, these are actual incidents. But what Iran has done is taken groups of sponsorship for terror entities around the globe. And I'm going to throw out a few names that Iran has been funding and Iran has been supporting and propping up for years, and these names, sadly, will become familiar with you. One, Hezbollah, which is based in Lebanon. Two, Hamas, which is financial headquarters are out of Qatar, but its working headquarters are in Gaza and the West Bank. PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a terrorist entity as deemed by the United States Congress and the EU. And the third, which is an important one to know, is the PIJ, which stands for Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Jihad is an Arab word for holy war. So the two attacks that happened on Monday were targeted attacks, one for sure by Israel, one maybe by Israel, that were really attacks on Iran. So allow me to explain. Iran is preparing and using the proxy in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Gaza to, crowd in and present multiple fronts of conflict for Israel. So in Lebanon, they worked through proxy of Hezbollah, which now has 150,000 rockets that are very precise, that are hidden in bunkers of places that it's against international law to hit, even though it's permissible if we know that there's artillery there. But if you put 100 or 1,000 rockets in a nursing home, you are presented as the person defending that with a major conundrum. You're presented with the same conundrum if you put those rockets and their launchers on playgrounds. 150,000 precision-guided rockets that can reach from the most northern part of Israel all the way to Eilat and are in the hands of Hezbollah, which is totally supported by Iran. Now, with the vacuum that's happening in Syria, Iran has made a significant play and has put its proxies there to take advantage of this vacuum of leadership that's happened during its civil war. And lastly, but perhaps most important, is the horrible leadership happening by PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hamas in Gaza, which sadly takes any of its relief efforts and other activities and uses them towards warfare against Israel's and innocents as opposed to infrastructure like schools and sewage and helping out their community. Now, some of you might ask the question, well, what's the difference really between Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah? And I'm going to give a very vulgar analogy, so I apologize in advance, but it's kind of like decoding the difference between bile and vomit. They're both terrible, but they both represent your body evacuating these disgusting parts from your body because it can't be in there anymore. And while indeed that is gross, there are some distinctions between them, but they both are bile that needs to be out of one's body. And Israel is in an effort to make sure that it lets know that Iran cannot have these proxies. Now, why now and why in this way? Two reasons. Number one, what I'm about to say is not meant to be political. But today, you can't say the word Shabbat Shalom without being a Rorschach test of, can you believe the way he said Shabbat Shalom? He's clearly a never-Trumper. So, don't read into the political reading of what I'm saying, but it's important to understand. If you want to know my politics, I'm happy to share it off the bema, but it's not my intention now. When President Obama entered the JCPOA, I believe it was an agreement that was good but significantly flawed. What I think, in my estimation, Jess Kirshner, the problem with the JCPOA was, one was the sunset clause, that after 10 to 15 years, it gave a pathway to Iran to now enrich uranium. Two, the sanctions were lifted as opposed to released over time, and the money was returned all at once to Iran that was held back in sanctions as opposed to returned in increments after good behavior. Now that President Trump has taken over, he has abrogated America's connectivity responsibility to the JCPOA. Now, those who are opposed to the JCPOA and those who are very against Iran applaud this action. I understand the applause. However, there's a big question of, now what? If America is not part of the JCPOA, is Iran still bound to the JCPOA? And what we saw this week is Iran blatantly saying loudly and clearly, if America is not in the JCPOA, we can begin to enrich uranium again. And now Mossad and other MI6 agents have said that Iran is enriching uranium again. And what is a blatant violation of what would have been the JCPOA, but without any indication of exactly what the recourse will be for doing so. Furthermore, in the president's statement to remove troops from Syria, the president has made clear, especially during an election year, that the last thing the president wants to do is to put more troops in the Middle East and to fight more wars of proxy in any form, which led Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to say, who's also in a political quagmire at this time, if we have to deal with the issue of Iran, it is incumbent upon Israel and Israel only. We cannot turn to any of our allies, including the United States, to fix this problem. Knowing that Iran was enriching uranium, knowing that they were taking this lack of the JCPOA for a spin, knowing that America is in an election cycle, and knowing that America is not, at this stage of where we are politically, going to engage in Tehran today, the JCPOA was taken out, if you will, and Israel and Iran came to a conflict. The conflict was one in which Iran continued to bolster up the PIJ in Gaza and bolster up Hezbollah in Syria and Lebanon. Israel decided that it was going to give a quick, stern, and important message to Iran, not on our watch. There might be a vacuum in leadership as you see it in America right now, and there might be a vacuum in leadership as you see it in Israel, but there really isn't. And here's the greatest irony of all. Go to Israel and you will see a country that has not solidified an election in almost an entire year. March was the last election, and there might be another one in March. They cannot solidify a government because they are disparate on their views. But when it came to the issue of bombing PIJ and bombing in Damascus, the entire government was unified with the exception of the Arab parties which abstained. The entire government. So whether you're part of Blue and White and Gantz, or whether you're part of Lapid, or whether you're part of Meretz, which is the ultra-left wing, all of them believe that we can't allow Iran to have a proxy in Syria, in Lebanon, or in Hamas. So all of these differences and distinctions that they debate and fight about all day long, there is zero daylight between any of these characters when it came to this action. You will not hear for a second Meretz or Benny Gantz challenging Benjamin Netanyahu's choice in bombing PIJ. Secondly, the head of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad has a lot of blood on his hands and had a blueprint out for more attacks against Israel. Their goal was specific: to destabilize Israel and to continue to threaten Israel. Hamas has a little bit of a different goal. That is to recapture Israel, call it Palestine. PIJ wants to recapture the entire region and make it into a caliphate. It's the difference, again, between that vomit and that bile and the process in which they want to do it. Now, the leader of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad was a man by the name of Atta, who brilliantly and disgustingly surrounded himself with children everywhere he went, including in his bedroom when he went to bed, because he knew the Israelis would never attack him and put collateral damage of children in the front line. Never. But one day, in fact, this past Monday, he got lazy. And he went to bed with his wife and no one else around, and Israel sent a very targeted bomb into his bedroom, and he is no longer, as is his wife. Now, what's interesting is that Israel and the Mossad almost never take credit for these things. They almost never say, hey, we did this, we want you to know, we're sorry, this happened, that happened, whatever. Israel immediately announced that they were responsible for this attack on the PIJ, which then led to 400 rockets raining in Israel in the course of 72 hours. And the reason why they announced it so loudly and proudly was to tell Iran without hesitation or reservation, don't even think about replacing this person with someone else. And for all of those people who think, oh, they'll just raise their hand and they'll wave it in the air and the next leader will come up, I don't know about you, but if there was a company that fired their last CEOs after 4 months, 6 in a row, would you be quick to take that job? All the more so with these leaders of PIJ who are instantly eliminated for their role in just the title. And no one is taking the PIJ role and saying, hey, we don't want to hurt Israel, we just want to create jobs and infrastructure. That's not part of the mantra. The attack in Damascus was done to really stymie Iran. Because it was done in Damascus, at the second in command of the Islamic Jihad, it wasn't able for Iran to throw their hands and say, this is an international attack on our people, because it was a proxy in Damascus. Seeing that Iran's people were in Damascus where they shouldn't have been in the first place, that's a violation of international law. So to call out crime on that attack would be to self-incriminate themselves as saying, we have proxies in Syria where we shouldn't be. Furthermore, with great irony, the border, with the exception of the civil war for the last 4 years, that has been the quietest for Israel over the last 30 years has been the Golan border, the Syrian border. In fact, almost all of the aggressions that have happened in the Syrian border, even during the civil war, have been accidental. There has never been a real intention of engaging the Israelis in a war, except for a few radical lone wolf ISIS fighters who were naive. So this attack on Syria was just targeted knowing that it would be much less likely to have a form of retaliation come in their direction. So this created an entire set of announcements and awareness for the Iranians to say, Israel to say the Iranians rather, not on our watch. We want you to know that we will not be deterred for a single minute. Now, Hamas, believe it or not, was wildly angry at this development with their neighbors in Gaza of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the equivalent of the vomit being mad at the bile. Why? Well, Hamas was engaged in very serious negotiations with the Israelis, which would result perhaps in not only the transfer of funds, which they need, excuse me, but also in the release of a significant number of Palestinian prisoners for the release of 2 bodies that were captured, killed in the 2014 war in Gaza. Now, the release of these 2 bodies and repatriating them to be buried in Israel is important for the Israeli public, because it tells everyone that no matter who their boys and girls are, no matter what they do on behalf of their country, to quote Les Miserables, we will bring them home. And it's important for all the elected officials to continue to push that, and they're really in the same conundrum they were in with Gilad Shalit as to whether or not to release prisoners on behalf of these 2 bodies. So Hamas had all of these energies and efforts that have been moving forward for about 6 months totally undermined, and all of that negotiation fell flat. Now, depending on where you stand politically, that's either a really good thing or it's a really bad thing. I don't know. It's too early to tell. But time will tell on to whether or not that was a good thing that it fell through. And I don't know in this case if having Hamas on our side against Palestinian Islamic Jihad is something we should be celebrating. To quote Benjamin Netanyahu, in this case, the enemy of my enemy is still my enemy. Now, the other complicating fact to consider is, what do we do with the JCPOA as we move forward? If we re-elect a Republican president, whoever that person may be, do they continue to abrogate from the role and connectivity of the JCPOA, or do they connect to the JCPOA? And in connecting to the JCPOA, do they hold a sense of responsibility? Do they totally leave it? How do they re-envision their role vis-a-vis Tehran? Because if Tehran continues to enrich uranium, the object of the JCPOA, whether it's 10 years or sunset, it doesn't work. No one wants Iran becoming a nuclear capability for 1,000 reasons, not the least of which is a Middle East arms race and a nuclear capability running OPEC. Second is, if we elect a Democrat president, do we just re-enter the JCPOA and renegotiate our terms, or do we renegotiate our entry? Which is one of the reasons why Iran is piling on right now, so that when it comes time to renegotiate whatever that entry might look like, whether before or after, they have more things in which to jettison. It's tantamount to my kids after, let's say, Purim, when they come here and they get a ton of candy, and I say, you're not keeping all that candy, and they grab all the candy on their site and say, I want to keep all of this, very consciously, because they know I'm going to take half of it away, no matter what the amount is. So by taking more of an amount and taking half it away, they still end up with a net gain. Iran's doing the same thing right now vis-a-vis the JCPOA, and I think that it's a conniving maneuver, but one that we have to be very conscious of if and when we go back to any form of renegotiation, either in the future or the immediate future. Lastly, I will tell you something that I think is worthy of celebration and worthy of applauding yourself on the back and doing more. 1, 400 rockets rained down in Israel in 72 hours. 400 rockets. 90% of those rockets either landed in a field knowing it would land in a field with no casualty because of the technology of the Iron Dome, or the Iron Dome intercepted those rockets. Iron Dome is the best example of collaboration between Israel and America. Were it not for you and your ability to lobby your congresspeople and elected officials and taxpayer dollars, we would not provide a blanket of security for Israel to live under. And you should all be proud of that, and you should make sure to call your congresspeople and the senator and thank them for Iron Dome and make sure they continue to rearm Iron Dome, because each of those interceptor missiles are $75,000. And for every missile that Hamas or PIJ launches that lands indiscriminately, Israel sends up 2 interceptors to be extra sure. That's $150,000 per missile. You do the math on 400 missiles. Okay? Secondly, for those of you who look through the lens of saying the poor Palestinians, I ache for them and we need to find justice for them, I understand part of your empathy, part being the operative word. You should be just as thankful for the Iron Dome, because were it not for the Iron Dome, Israel would have been and would continue to be in Gaza, and there'd be much more loss of life for Palestinian civilians, and you should celebrate that as well. That's one thing to be happy about. Here's the second thing to be happy about that the news doesn't pick up because we're so focused on other things happening domestically. In the last 6 months, in Iraq and in Lebanon, there have been wild and massive protests by young people, the same age as the people 40 years ago that were protesting in Iran. But they're protesting something totally different because they're from a second generation, in some cases a third. And what are they protesting in Iraq and in Lebanon? They're throwing up their hands and they're saying, time out. Our government is absolutely corrupt. They are stealing from us and raping us and taking everything away from us. We just want a normal democracy. We just want a sense of freedom. We want to go on the internet and don't want to be seen with Big Brother as what we can log into and not log into. We want to have the ability that our brothers and sisters in Europe and America and Australia are having, and we don't care about Israel. Israel is not the source of what's going wrong in our country. And America is not the source of what's going wrong in our country. The leadership is the source of what's going wrong in our country. And they have been protesting in Iraq, and they have been protesting in Lebanon. Now, the leader of Hezbollah is a guy by the name of Hanan Nasrallah. He's been living like a gopher in a bunker for the last 12 years because Israel has been looking to target him and take out that cancer that represents the leadership of Hezbollah. He has been very nonchalant and paid no attention to these loud voices that have been marching. But I think it's a mistake on his part, but good for us in the long run. Why? Because these voices, just like 40 years ago, have the ability to tilt the scales back to the other extreme. They have the ability to change Lebanon and Iraq out of frustration and upset with just a sense of normalcy that they want. And if they stay determined and focused, and they can overpower those that are looking to just do evil, then the pendulum can swing from where it went 40 years ago during the Iran-Contra affair, or the Iran hostage affair, to bring a sense of decency and normalcy back into that region. Iran was such an open and liberal country that became radicalized, and now these radical countries could turn back just the other way. Think about this important fact in closing. The Berlin Wall, which separated East and West Berlin and separated communism and socialism from democracy, was literally built overnight. It was done clandestine with a group of architects and engineers who put up barbed wire to separate what would be East and West Jerusalem without telling the populace, and it was done overnight. People woke up and realized that they could not access and go over the border. And the amazing thing about the Berlin Wall is that it came down overnight. And for us, we can think about the change that radicalized our relationship with Iran and tilted us to a place where we had a sworn enemy, and maybe, in a sense of hope, that pendulum can swing back. I pray in closing that we all continue to stand next to our homeland of Israel, and that our homeland always sleep under the blanket of love and security and a hope for a better tomorrow. Amen. We're going to continue our service, page 184, the Chatzi Kaddish. Please rise.
Yitgadal v'yitkadash